Today, we're honored to have two experts joining us to discuss the biases we experience as a culture and a community of many colors with a history of racial discrimination from our Latin American countries and the discriminations we face in the United States. It is essential to bring up topics that matter in our community, and racism is one of them, especially in a year full of physical and virtual protest against this social issue that has been highlighted the most due to the pandemic. The purpose of this panel is to go over the historical background of the Latinx racial issue outside and within our community. How can we be or become aware of it, and different ways in which we can take action against it as journalists. Please welcome Adjunct Lecturer Janette Torres-Arroyo from the Puerto Rican and Latinx Department at Brooklyn College, who has worked since 2006 teaching Latin American history and training bilingual educators. Torres-Arroyo has been a teacher from K through 12 in the New York City public school system for 19 years, and she has worked mostly with newcomers from different Latin American countries. Let's also welcome Dr. David Brotherton from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Since 1994, Dr. Brotherton teaches youth resistance, marginalization, and deportation at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and the director of the Social Change and Transgressive Studies Project, a project that I think we should all look into. It is committed to supporting research projects that examine the impact of criminalization and systemic inequalities on society's most marginalized members. He's also an author, and among his recent books are Immigration Policy in the Age of Punishment, Detention, Deportation, and Border Control in 2017, Las Pandillas como Movimiento Social, or the Gangs as a Social Movement, in 2016, and Banished to the Homeland, Dominican Deportees and Their Stories of Exile in 2011. The first question we have is, how do you define racism and how do you define colorism?
Racism it's really a really complex term because it essentially has two meanings, right? One says that it's the belief that some people are superior and some people are inferior. And then with that, it also encompasses the acceptance of the inequalities and the treatments and the behaviors and the discrimination. Although the term, some people believe that the term needs to be updated, and we need to add to that, because it's essentially the belief and then the acceptance. And with that, that belief and that acceptance then will guide your behavior or dictate your behavior. So defining racism, it's essentially a two-meaning word in that case. Now colorism, right? Colorism is a term that when we apply it to Latin American communities, right? And how is it that they use colorism in terms of the word color and how we see ourselves, how we identify ourselves, right? And the denial of our background, we would say that colorism is essentially taking that belief that some people are better or superior and then bringing it over to what we look like. What is it that our skin looks like? What is the color of our skin, the texture of our hair, and then giving privileges to those that we think are lighter in texture, in the color of the skin, the differences in the texture of the hair. And so colorism is essentially that bias that we practice, that discrimination that we practice. And it's not just the Latin American community that does that. It also happens in the African American community. It also happens to an extent in the Caucasian communities, right? So the privileges that we give to those who have a lighter skin color, and the hair texture, the difference in the hair texture.
Thanks for inviting me. Well, I'm a sociologist, right, and foremost a criminologist by training, and so we confront racism, as part of my research on the streets. We confront it, challenge it within the institutions, and so on and so forth. So racism, it's always part of some kind of power structure. So we mostly, everybody faces it at some point. Either you benefit from it or you don't. In a kind of white supremacist society, it's a structured issue. It's systemic racism is practiced as a way to maintain power amongst white elites, and obviously with the history of slavery like this country, it's going to be in everyday life. And why certain children are born into certain zip codes and can never move out. Historically they would have faced segregated in policed boundaries, policed environments that wouldn't allow them to move across from, say, 110th Street in Harlem below down into Manhattan. You couldn't do it if you were black up until not long ago. And so it's systemic and it's structured, but at the same time it's also prejudiced based on interpersonal beliefs and so on and so forth. But from a sociological perspective, it's always a social construction. There's nothing in it in terms of, as we are divided along racial lines. Mother Africa, really, we'll owe ourselves to the same continent, and our racial, different blood groups has changed over time. But it's the power groups, be it the power structures under colonialism or under imperialism or under contemporary capitalism, that gives racism its currency and allows it to continue and reproduce. And you see it clearly in the current president of the United States, who has absolutely no hesitation in using racism in order to be elected. The colorism is somewhat different in a sense. Clearly, it's socially constructed, and in different societies, there'll be different levels of colorism. In certain societies, we're nearly often coming from an anti-black perspective, because again, going back to slavery and so on and so forth, and that's become part of a kind of dominant ideology practiced through religion and through different racial and class policies. And it filters down, practiced, as we know, through Spanish colonialism and its whole list of racial and colorizing the populations that were oppressed and were exploited ad nauseam, and so on and so forth. And this carries on into everyday life through the television. Why do you have so many white actors and actresses? Why do you have, and blacks have, until, certainly historically, have less opportunities, again, or in advertising? Why do you have so many people of a certain color that are there, selling, whatever it is, perfume versus, and so on and so forth. And it's so interesting, it's so contradictory as well, because the other side of colorism, right, is when you can benefit from the promotion, right, of a certain, black aesthetic, or it's black chic or whatever. For example, in hip hop, the capitalism has absolutely no hesitation in exploiting colorism, right, in terms of its own profit gain and so on and so forth. So it's very contradictory. But primarily we have to really understand the power structures that undergird racism or colorism. But at base, it's a social construction. And really, in a world in which we were fully emancipated, hopefully it would have no currency at all, since there's only one race, and that's the human race.
Another question that goes along with it is, where does this Latinx racism come from historically?
Based on the history. You see, because remember, this colorism, this racism, it's all learned behavior. Like he said, it's a construct, right? But it's learned behavior. It's something that we pass down. So looking at the history that was brought over, right? The practices that were put in place that dictated who was going to get the privilege. And so looking at the history, I mean, we can take it as far as the 15th century. We want to go that far and say that it came into, right, this side of the Americas, so the new Americas, And during that contact, how did that contact take place? And so who were those who were privileged? And so that a system it's put in place to benefit those that are essentially at the top. And so creating a caste system where certain groups, right, will be at the very top and are enjoying all the benefits of the new world, of the trade, the economy as it develops, and then those who come below them who are then exploited, right? So creating a caste system that then not only is in practice, but it's also law. Just like when we look at, I like to refer to my Puerto Rico, that's where I'm from, and how the Spaniards dealt with Puerto Rico in the early 19th century. How they try to, what we historians like to say, whiten the population. And so what was essentially the law that they put in place so that they can bring in people from a particular geographic area in Europe that will then come populate this island and hopefully intermarry and lighten the population. So that with that, you also have a system where you're already looking at where are the privileges, who's benefiting from the privileges. So in Puerto Rico, when that happened, and I like to use Puerto Rico as an example because that's where I come from, and I lived it. And so when we talk about the racism, I know that my grandparents intermarried, and my grandmother and my father's side was blonde, blue-eyed, and my grandfather was of African descent. And so my father and his siblings were essentially had different tones of color skin. They had some had bright blue eyes, bright green eyes, and how the dynamics in the family essentially played out. And then as the grandchildren are born, what are the things that are said to the grandchildren, so that essentially you have to make sure that you whiten the race, so you cannot bring home somebody who's darker than you. In my case, all my sisters have straight hair. I'm the only one at home with curly hair, and my mother always had an issue with my hair, and I like to wear curls, and the rejection is so aggressive that it begins to, it shapes you, it shapes your thinking, it shapes your feelings towards this learned behavior that has been initiated even before you were born. And so looking at it through essentially the perspective of my own family and how this extended family taught the young ones, the newborns, and so that if somebody married, they make sure they're happy or they're not, depending on the skin color, the texture of their hair. And so what are their babies looking like? So we're looking at an old history, so it's not new. So when you say where does it come from, I would say it's old. It's learned behavior that has been carried over, essentially a system that was a structure that was put in place, a caste that was put in place, laws that essentially make sure those things happen.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Janette in terms of learned behavior, but just as you can learn it, you can unlearn it, right?
Yes.
So and it's so interesting how it changes also across generations. So you have generations grandfathers, would never, marry a person of a different ethnicity or, different racial color, and then the children go down, and then, it changes, it completely changes again as people, become accustomed, and we're in such a kind of racially and ethnically pluralistic society, with globalization, basically come from everywhere. And it's only these sort of codified laws not just our personal, but codified laws that reinforce divisions. And of course, those divisions play a very important role in the political reproduction of a political class, right? To maintain power, divide and rule is classic, in histories of colonial conquest and so on and so forth. India, how was India able to be maintained by, a few thousand soldiers, this population of hundreds of millions of people, and buying people off, and you promote certain, literally certain castes to be certain things within the military or the police force or the bureaucracy, and you maintain it. And, India to this day is living not just with the caste system that, came from their own internal histories, but that which was exploited by British colonialism to the nth degree. But I find it, or let's say, for example, the Dominican Republic, we've spent, quite a bit of time. And this, the role, the status of Haitians that just divide, basically Hispaniola. And, and there you have, Dominicans, with black ancestry, and Haitians with black ancestry, but, maybe Haitians are blacker than the Dominicans, and it's used constantly by Dominican elites to set one group against the other and to super exploit Haitians, because as they live in very precarious circumstances, are very difficult to get citizenship. But the benefit is always towards a certain power structure always benefits from the practice and the perpetuation of colorism, ethnicism, or racism. And but the struggle is always just as much as, in the sense, the power structure is there, and the power structure represents the importance of these practices, racial practices. There's always this contestation of these codes and these practices. I mean, this is what's so beautiful about the present period, especially after the George Floyd uprising, right? We saw on the streets and right across schools, universities, and a hunger for our history, rather the other history, the contesting of statues. Why is that statue there? Why should that guy be there in that history? Which is fantastic, because it shows you can unlearn all these kind of ideological, historical constructs that we've adapted to. We not necessarily accept it, but we just go along with it. It becomes normalized. It's part of everyday life, right? And people are saying, no, we're not going to accept it anymore. Just like we're not going to accept boundaries within spaces, cross those spaces. You can't cross that space if you don't come from here, and all that sort of thing. No, forget about it. We are going to do that. And, that's what is so important about education. Education, has to be seen as not simply gaining new knowledge, but contesting things, right? Contesting realities which are constructed for us, so that we make our own history, which is part of this long history of the struggle against racial oppression.
Very good point you just made, because my next question has to do with this. How can we have solidarity within our own community? And what can we do to prevent this whole racism and colorism issue that exists from outside and inside also of our community?
I think education is definitely the key, because yes, you can unlearn it. You can unlearn it by talking about it, facing it. I think in the Latinx community, I think that our biggest issue is denial. So that families, although they may say, arréglate el pelo, fix your hair, they're not telling you, they're not telling you outwardly or explicitly, you know, your hair shouldn't look that way, or make it straight, or make it differently. They're telling you in a subtle way. And so most times they don't even realize that what they're doing or what they're saying is hurtful. So definitely making people aware. And how do we do that, right? So we need to like help them unlearn it. And so as an educator myself, I feel that we have opportunity for that here, especially in New York, where we have so many segregated schools and we have community schools. There is the potential, right? The benefit of having these community schools where we can then say, you know, let's talk to the people. Let's talk about this. We have an issue. We have a lot of newcomers, like it is in the case of PS 89 where I work. And so these newcomers are coming from Latin American countries that, because they're children and they have no filter, they call themselves all kinds of ugly racial slurs that they probably don't even know where they come from, that it's probably words that they have heard at home maybe, or they have heard in their community, and so they repeat them. And so yes, I believe that what we need to do is help them create these spaces that will help them unlearn, or perhaps make some awareness, take stock of their own views and perceptions and prejudices, and say, well, as a community school, we can perhaps allocate funding. There are a lot of community schools that are, you know, receive a lot of extra fundings that they use for either coaching and other things that impact the learning environment. So why not allocate some funds where we can say, okay, so we can then maybe start with the parents. Why not give them some workshops and address the fact that, yeah, your children are speaking this way. And so what does it really mean? How hurtful is it for other students in our community? And we are all one community. So make spaces where we can perhaps teach, right, the parents, make them aware. And in turn, we can also, you know, hope that it carries, so that maybe it will be not just programs for parents, workshops for parents, speaking to the parents, but also creating programs. Maybe the DOE needs to take some responsibility and say, well, the same way we've been trying to deal with bullying in the schools, maybe we can put a program together and say, you know what, where does this bullying come from? Sometimes it has to be, it's the feeling. So that construct of I'm better and you're not is there. And so the reaction or the behavior may be somewhat different, but not so much so. And so that perhaps programs need to be in place and funds allocated where a curriculum should be developed where it is addressed in the classroom. And so that children are taught from the very beginning, just like teachers are required to teach from the very early grades about bullying. Why not about this racist behavior that it's hurtful? And so we can tackle it that way in education, because it's absolutely necessary. You know, in the environment that we're living in now, we as teachers, we were required to address the political unrest, to address the protests and the murders, why they were protesting. But teachers are not giving essentially the curriculum, the materials, or the time, and maybe the training to address or present a history where this is what we need to know and this is how we can change it. We can change the reactions that we are taking now, that we are practicing now. And so, yeah, creating spaces in education, in the school system, and I would say not just with the Department of Education, essentially in the community schools, but even in academia.
I think, you know, Janette sort of hit on a point which is key to this, and it applies to nearly all different forms of oppression, not just racism. And that's really that we've got to settle on building community, and as a fundamental principle of building community is solidarity, and getting away from this individualism and this constant stratification of people in the service of what? You know, I mean, really, the system is so based on commodification of everything we do, how we look, how we talk, how we behave, which, you know, most of us really, I talk to my kids, you know, my students, and they're all, you know, they're strivers, they're nearly all working class kids, you know. And, you know, I said, well, you know, what are you here for? I mean, seriously, what you're going to get a degree, you're going to get this, you know, what's it all about? You know, and obviously, you know, the main reason they're there is to get a job, right? Is to move up in the world, and to put themselves, you know, a more advantageous position than they would otherwise have been, probably more advantageous than their peers. And they're constantly, right, competing, right? They're constantly fighting to, you know, basically stay in the same place, because so many times the rug's pulled from underneath them, despite all their best intentions and their best efforts and everything else. They can't seem to get ahead, and yet they're doing all the right things, right? And this is a system which has us doing all this, competing with ourselves, competing against other people, and not building the kind of communities that we need, whereby, you know, we can come together with all our different talents and so on and so forth, and all these other divisions behind us, or between us. You know, it's a nonsense. Complete, you know, because we're too busy building the community. Yes, we celebrate difference. Yes, we celebrate each other's histories. Yes, we do. Yeah, but not at the point where we separate ourselves and we put more, you know, sort of status on that culture or that culture versus another culture. But, you know, that's learned, but it's consistently perpetuated by a system that breeds elitism and breeds, you know, some people who are seen as, you know, revered talents, and other people who are completely dismissed and become essentially disposable, you know, individuals, almost from the day they're born. There's a brilliant, you know, years ago, you know, I'm talking 60 years ago now, actually, you know, one of the greatest experiments and studies was done up in Harlem by the psychologist Kenneth Clark. You know, when he went into the schools in Harlem and he had the kids draw pictures, right, of what's beauty and what's handsome. And, you know, they would draw these things, and it was all the beauty and the handsome and the pretty was always white girls or white boys, and always the ugly ones were black, right? And, you know, and so where do you get these ideas from? These are 8 and 9 year old children, right? And so we started, this was, you know, around about 61, 62 in his book, Dark Ghetto. And, you know, how did they learn this? Did they learn this from their parents? Did they learn it? You know, how was it so ingrained in these children to condemn themselves, right? This is how social reproduction works, right? The power structure. Why, you know, do so many young women have so little self-value? You know, because of, you know, physical appearances or whatever, you know, it destroys them, you know, at such young ages. You know, how is sexism and so on and so forth. How, you know, we contend with all that, but it basically leads, obviously into the reproduction of a power structure. But we can, and community overcomes that, right? Fighting alongside one another overcomes that. That's how we do it in practice, not simply in our head, but we live it. We live in a different kind of world. We imagine a different world, and we practice that different world, either belonging to unions or belonging to student groups, or becoming involved in a political praxis. But you can't do it just in your head. You have to do it in some kind of practice to live it out. Otherwise, the ideology that we is so toxic in this society. If you just simply do it through abstraction and just a bit of education here and bring in a course here, yeah, that's fine. But unless we live it, then it's really difficult to win much longer term battles. And of course, the period we're in now, it's so we face such cataclysmic challenges on every single level, massive rich and poor divides, or environmental apocalypse, or obviously public health. It forces us now to confront all of these things that historically have artificially divided us. And so we actually become, strangely enough, even though in our darkest hour, it also becomes, we could make the biggest leaps forward.
Definitely. We should, as a community, be able to kind of awaken ourselves to know exactly how to come together and do this type of things that we're doing right now, having experts like you, the two of you, to showcase what exactly we need as a community. One question that we have as journalists, of course, we're taught to be neutral and focus on facts. Do you think that this can lead to ignoring substantial racial issues within and outside the Latinx community? Have you, as non-journalists, both of you, seen a lack of substantive focus on these issues in the media, in the news?
I would say yes. I feel that the media, I find that it's become more and more selective, right? So that, and I will have to say that I am not, I listen to English TV. I used to listen to Spanish television, but it was sometimes very difficult because the medium is for us to see this image that gets projected. And so to me, I never really saw it as a positive image. And so in the reporting, they're always, I would say, sidestepping certain issues. And some issues in the Latinx community will be brought to light when other pressing issues that will definitely be more important, that perhaps lead to these other problems, whether it's about language or communities themselves, or economics, or immigration, or politics. The real basis of those conflicts get ignored so that they're not presented. So that if the root of a conflict has a lot to do with perhaps the economics or the privileges within a community based on whoever it is there, whether it is a Puerto Rican versus a Dominican, or a Cuban versus a Puerto Rican, and so the real issues are essentially kind of pushed under the rug and then presented as something other than, and so that the real issue, yes, do get ignored. And when like I said to Angie before, when I look at the news, I always say, yes, what's the real message behind this news report? What's the real message? What are they really telling me? who is this message for? Who is this report for? So if they're reporting on a crime in, let's say, Cypress Hills, what are they really saying? What are they really saying? Are they saying that it's a neighborhood nobody should be in? Or is it or are they saying that it's a neighborhood that everybody should flee from? And if that's the case, why? Why? What's the real issue behind it? Is there an agenda behind this reporting? Are you presenting this particular view in order to say, well, perhaps a change needs to happen? Almost opening the door for other events to take place. Something that we see it all the time. Cypress Hills. And so Cypress Hills, what's happening in Cypress Hills? A poor community, predominantly Dominican, Puerto Rican, Central American, South American. And so what is it that we're seeing there? We see a lot of urban decay, but then we also see that when we look at the news, when I look at the news, I feel like, why they keep pointing at Cypress Hills? Why? It's not that they're coming in to take care of this urban decay. It's not that they're coming in to offer help. It's not like they are offering or they are allocating funds to help this immigrant community. It's not that. It's always, you know, it's a crime-ridden community. And so why is that? There's a lot of good things and a lot of good people happening there. So why is it that we always see it in the news as a negative? And so, yeah, those negatives happen for a reason. And so it's always, maybe always the violence, maybe always the crime, but the deeper issues that are taking place within that community are being ignored.
Yeah, I've worked a lot, with journalists over the last several decades, and I've, published a number of articles in newspapers and magazines, and very close friends of mine are, major journalists and so on and so forth. And, it's all, it's a constant battle. I mean, the freedom of the press is to those who own one, right? I mean, that's historically it. I mean, the notion that, we live in a free expression and so on and so forth, and you get your voice out there, is a myth. And it's a media monopoly, essentially. There's only probably 3 or 4 major corporations that control about 80%, 90% of the news now. There's massive collapse of newspapers, local newspapers across the United States. As that happens, they become more and more dominated by ultra-conservative channels, like Fox News, for example, reflect basically the values of its billionaire owner, Rupert Murdoch, or and it has enormous, and all of this stuff is racially coded, as dog whistles all over the place, right? You don't have to say it; you just say he's a member of a gang, and it's all over, right? In terms of kind of racial labeling and stereotypification, and certain neighborhoods, as Janet said, or archetypal places of the dangerous classes, right? I mean, it goes way back, be it East New York or Bed-Stuy or whatever. It's, and it's constantly played over and over and over again, the same stories. Every now and again you'll get someone striving to do good in that society, and they'll get a feature and they'll become celebrated. But the actual living everyday life of that community, which is often a very tightly kind of tight-knit community where there's a lot of social reciprocity, because there's a lot of poverty, so they have to help each other out. There's a lot of amazing culture going on there, but only some of it gets noticed and then commodified, as you see with music and so on and so forth. But those deeper stories are rarely presented in so many of our media outlets. And it's, you know, it's very difficult. But, you know, with social media, granted, you know, there's other channels and people could start up their own, you know, kind of blogs and so on and so forth. And I understand that journalists now basically have to be the jack of all trades. They have to be able to write an article, make a short film, God knows what else, you know, 10 things at the same time and multitask. You know, I mean, I know, you know, understand all that. But, you know, it's still, you know, the major way people get their news. It still have this enormous impact on how we see the world and how we see ourselves. Who, you know, that they're the ones that frame, frame stories that framed in this way. You know, why did, you know, Trump have so much power? It's because he was part of the 24-hour news circle, and he became addicted to Trump, right? Which is extraordinary, right? You get addicted to this absolute imbecile, and yet you can't let it go. You know, it's incredible. It's like being, you know, like a heroin, you know, injection. And, you know, but why was that? You know, how was that? Why, you know, how did we put up with that for so long? Why did we go back and give him the time of day? I know he's the president and so on and so forth, but it was more than that. He got at these things in us, this kind of strange, I don't know what it was, vicariousness or this loathing and self-loathing. I mean, he really, or perhaps not he knew, but certainly his handlers knew what they were onto. And what they were onto, you know, and I don't want to sort of get away from the, you know, the central thing here, was massive levels of resentment in American society, massive levels of frustration, massive levels of unfounded paranoia, right? Massive levels of, you know, I deserve this and I don't get it, right? Levels of, you know, could be white entitlement or whatever, or just simply denying, you know, being denied because you can't make the American dream. Basically, so many people live the American nightmare rather than the American dream. But these feelings inside of us, these very subjective things that eat away at us, right? Why can't we do this? We should be doing this. You can't go anywhere with it, right? You can't go. The union hall doesn't exist anymore. Maybe the political thing, the forum that you could have gone to and spoken out in your community doesn't exist. There's no space for that. So you live with it yourself. And you go through a lot of self-blame. And then after you got through the self-blame, you have to blame somebody else. And it's usually the other person, the other, black, brown, woman, you know, whatever. You know, you know, and the media beautifully parades all these others that you can choose from. And you get rid of all this kind of anger that you have nowhere to go with it, right? Instead of going into some form of empowerment and community building and solidarity, you know. And that's what we've been living through, right? We've been living through this, and the media has played a terrible role in perpetrating. I mean, there's obviously exceptions, but you know, there's so many times when the media is not challenged the status quo and given people the time of day when they really shouldn't have, and so on and so forth. Now, you know how, you know, and again, you are up, even your best intentions, how well trained you are. And I know you're at a great school, Columbia Journalism. I've given so many interviews to your students over the years on gangs and deportation and God knows what else. And you know, so incredibly well trained you come, and but you know, for all those great skills, you still have to go and find a job in a structure which you have to adapt to. Right, because otherwise you won't get a job. You won't be employed, and you have to adapt to those. You know, whatever the proprietor deems is important. You can go out, and you have a certain leeway, right? You have a certain flexibility, a certain freedom, but you certainly know when you've crossed the boundary, and you come back to edit this or you edit that, and so on and so forth. I'll give you one great example, and you know, as you probably know, or some of you know anyway. I've been studying deportation in New York City since about 2001, and so 20 odd years of it. And when I first started looking at why so many people were literally disappearing from New York City, right? And by the way, there's still to this day not been a single story on that. All these years since 1996, we've lost something like 8,000 people a year to deportation. There's still not one single story in there. And most of those people, by the way, are black or brown, right? About 80–90% of them. When I started looking at it in 2001, 2002, so the massive draconian laws, anti-immigration, deportation laws came in around 1996. So we'd lived in the city with 6 years. You know how many stories there were on deportation? Three stories in the New York Times by Nina Bernstein. It was the only stories I found on deportation. And we'd lost in that time, in that 6-year period, we probably lost something like, 40,000 people had been deported for life. Most of them green card holders from New York City. And we had 3 stories on it. And most of those people, as I say, were Caribbean and Central America. And I'm going, how does this happen? With 40,000 people from, Staten Island that disappeared, do you think there wouldn't be a story about them? Or, somewhere Woodside, Queens or something, or it'd been Irish Americans that were deported? Because there'd been tons of stories. But because, it was the other community, it didn't merit anything. And in fact, there were no real, any kind of deluge of stories on the missing of New York City until around 2005 and 2006. And it was only because the Dominican community actually, at long last, after 10 years of seeing so many of their parents and uncles being deported, they sat down in Federal Plaza and refused to move. And that was the first protest against deportation in New York City. It took 10 years. And then we started getting stories. And then the media started going into Washington Heights and started figuring it out, or into Corona, Queens, and seeing, where are the Central Americans? And then, and then it started, right? But it didn't start the other way around, that the journalists were out there ferreting around. It started people in action saying, no mas, basta, we ain't going further, and that's the issue. That's the issue.
So they had to take action before we actually had.
Before it became a story.
Yes. Just because we're reminding them the time for you guys, I'm going to open now the discussion to members and also the remaining of the audience that we have here today. Vincent, one of our members, have a question for you guys. Vincent, go ahead.
Yes, hi. Again, thank you for joining us today. My question, kind of follows up on this idea of journalism, and it's specific to how can journalists shed light on racism within the Latinx community? We've talked about, maybe not racism, because that is definitely a power structure, but colorism in the way we treat others because we approach them to be different than us, even though we are part of the umbrella Latinx community.
Going by the title of your panel, the solidarity, right? That's the in solidarity against
Racism
and the biases. I would say that, how to shed light. I would say that as a teacher and as one who loves to encourage people to write, although I don't do a whole lot of writing myself, it would be nice to see maybe a feature story on maybe a group. It could be any Latin American group where the multiracial features can be presented, or the mosaic of what we are or who, what we look like can be presented, not as just as a story of our rejection of each other, but maybe as a romance story with colorism. Right? Take the opposite. I would encourage where the many hues that we possess that are within our communities can be expressed, and why. To present a history where it's a positive history of who we are. I know, and I'm thinking in terms of how they advertise genealogy, checking
Mhm.
your DNA.
Mhm.
And so, and I know that as a Puerto Rican, I know that a few years ago, the Puerto Rican community was very happy because some DNA, something or other said that Puerto Ricans were 72% white European, and that that the other percentages were a small percentage of African, and then another percentage of indigenous, of Taínos, right? I personally say, wait a minute, that's not true for me. And my mother is Puerto Rican because my mother's grandfather was Chinese. So what happened to the Chinese DNA? And who knows what else? I know that in my family, a lot of us, in my mother's side, a lot of us look Chinese. A lot of my family members look very Chinese. And then the other big part of her family are redheads. So how did that happen? And do not look Chinese. So what happened there? So I would say, taking the perspective of teaching, of presenting, documenting this mosaic in a historical way, where it comes in a light, in a positive light, where people can actually say, wow, I didn't know that. You know, this was a great report. I learned, you know, that I don't have to get tested, because in a test, how foolproof is this DNA test? And then a lot of people don't know, you know, what happens to this DNA, right? That it goes in CODIS and, you know, that kind of thing. And so then presenting it in a way where people can learn from it, I would say. Whether it's a short feature, whether it's a documentary, or whether it's just a report, a one-time report on any particular community that, like the professor said, is struggling, is working, is helping each other out, is doing wonderful things for each other, and the differences within that community, how they, although they may be different, although they may come from different places, although they may look like they cannot be related, that, because I feel that as a Latina, that we are all related. It's one community. And so presenting it in a way where we are teaching, and so that using your medium as a teaching tool to bring, then perhaps shed light in a positive way, where people would say, look, this is who we are, and this is why.
I think good journalism, you know, has to be really always concerned with a strong narrative, right? To bring, you know, to make people, have people identify with the subjects, and you know, follow the story. It's interesting, and it helps, you know, in you know, reading about, you know, what these different manifestations of colorism and whatever it is, that they can begin to reflect on themselves, and it helps them become informed more about their own daily lives and how it relates to their own daily lives. And then, you know, good journalism, you know, makes linkages, you know, helps people to, you know, think about, promote and provoke other connections and ideas, you know, and in terms of the, you know, colorism, kind of the consequences, you know, of and the injuries, social injuries that occur, psychological and so on and so forth, people being demeaned and feeling demeaned, and so on and so forth, and all of these things. So, you know, there you start with a, you know, fairly sort of straightforward concept, but it has so many different manifestations, and it takes the reader to the next level of thinking about social life, really.
One question has Arlene Schulman. Arlene?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm enjoying the discussion. First, let me just say that I've worked on a story about the Negro Leagues, which happens to have its 100th anniversary. And a fact that I didn't know was that the league was actually integrated by Latinos before Jackie Robinson. However, there was colorism there. So those who most were Cuban, who passed for white were able to play. Those who were dark, no. So my question actually to the professor is this: I'm just insanely curious as to why this man would do this. Is Sammy Sosa. Sammy Sosa was a hero in the Dominican community. I live up in Washington Heights, so I know. Very handsome man, very handsome. He was dark. So what? He decided that he was going to bleach his skin, and which is now about like the color of cream cheese, and he looks awful. What do you think he hoped to accomplish? How did he think that was going to advance his life, his ego? I mean, it's beyond me. I just think I can't even imagine what even that bleaching process was like in terms of being painful and precise. But I saw nothing wrong with the way that he looked like, but apparently he did. What's your take on his self-identity?
Michael Jackson, right, is another case. They're in a business, surrounded, rich white dudes, producers and the owners of the teams, many of the coaches. I mean, he's surrounded by, this sort of white power structure, and unfortunately, baseball, like basketball, right? It's mainly played by players of color, right? But then, not many are in those sort of big ownership positions. I don't know. I can't. It's so deeply. It must be, even with all the money that Sosa has and his fame and fortune. Clearly, on a social psychological level, he's been damaged, right? He's Daniano, right? He's really something. They've gotten into his inner fabric, his inner way of developing himself, right? I mean, that's it, isn't it? Is how we develop our identity and a sense of self. You can have a completely different sense of self at the age of 13 or 14, and then you go out into this other world, and where things are more esteemed and it's more clear, who has the power and who doesn't, and your identity, can be totally corrupted. I mean, we see it over and over and over again, don't we? On different levels, and I think that's probably where he's fallen prey. We see it obviously with people with getting their face reconfigured and God knows what else, taking out the blackness from their nose, or taking out this, whatever feature it happens to be, because you can't live with yourself. You're not happy with yourself as you constantly bombarded by images that can be deeply demeaning or never sufficient. You're never skinny enough. You're never muscular enough. You're never this. You're never that. You got the wrong kind of eyebrows. Endlessly we're picked about. Endlessly in a world, right? In a world where we're bombarded with images, all worse than ever with social media. And I think it has a tremendously distorting and toxic set of consequences for even those among us who are even the most wealthy, strangely enough.
Yes, and I agree with all of that. But I initially, when we started seeing that in the media a few years ago, I thought it was very sad. But it wasn't until I went to work with the Dominican children in middle school that I really saw the impact of that action. And why? Because I thought it was very sad in terms of the perspective or the message that he was giving, you know, 7th graders, 8th graders, these young Dominican children that are dealing with so many issues in their own right, in terms of immigration and learning English, trying to better their Spanish, trying to learn the content areas, and their issues as children that are coming into puberty, and then to see an image that that really, I think, kind of essentially said to them, you know, I was black and now I'm not, or did he think he was not, or, and so the reaction of the children, that sadness that, you know, Sammy Sosa used to look like this and now he looks like this. And so to me, I felt like it was a really, really sad in terms of the young Dominican community. I felt, you know, looking through the eyes of the children and how they reacted and the mixed messages that they're getting, because was there any positive that I can say about it in a classroom setting, other than he was a great player, and that he was very talented, and that you know, whether he did for his community or not. So trying to kind of use the moment, that teaching moment, to say, you know what, there's more to it than just, you know, whitening the skin. There's a lot more. So that maybe reframing from judgment was the best thing that we can do. So that because we never know, you know, what was his thinking. So perhaps we can say, oh yeah, so he felt that, like the professor said, you know, being white, it will give you more privileges. But then he was already a privileged man. He was already, we can say that he was a wealthy man. He was famous. He was known. He was talented. There was no need for that. So then stress the fact that maybe there was something else behind that really pushed him to say, okay, so my skin the way it is now is not good enough. But to kind of soften, maybe putting it that way, soften the blow for the children that are looking at him, and that perhaps they may or may not see him as a model for them, right? In terms of his drive, in terms of his talent, and pursuing a career in what he wanted to do, yes, but then what are the other issues, right? That we need to think, that we have no idea what they are, but reframing, the only thing I could say as a teacher was, let's refrain from making a judgment call, and then let's look at the positive, right? And so we don't know what the life is like for him now. We know that these children were looking at him in a different light, right? So I thought it was I looked at it that way as a teacher, looking at the impact that he had, and this action in his part had on the young Dominican boys.
Thank you, Arlene, for that question. So I would like to know if there's any other question from the panel right now. Anyone else with a question? Vincent?
Very quick question. It actually follows up on Arlene's question, which I think is very important for us as journalists. Is do you think that it is important for us, you know, to promote the fact that we are part of the Latino community, that we, you know, some of us can speak Spanish, some of us can't, you know, some of us look more white, some of us look less so, you know, all that stuff. Do you think that it's still important, you know, for us to give an example of what a Latino can do for those young children, especially, you know, Janette, you know, the kids who are looking up for a role model?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I think it's really important. And I think that's one of the things that maybe as a journalist, right, that we can say, highlight those wonderful role models, right? And then because we need them. Communities like Cypress Hills that are predominantly Dominican at this moment, you know, and Spanish speakers, really need those models. I think that you know, the whole idea that you know, okay, so I see a Dominican teacher and I see Dominican baseball players is not enough, because I think one of the things that one of the mixed messages they get is that, oh yeah, we could only be maybe a teacher, or maybe we could only be a baseball player, and I want to be a baseball player, right? And so they don't realize that, yeah, there are so many other things. Yeah, I can be a journalist, right? Feature, yeah, I can be out there getting the news, writing about what's going on. And so definitely, yes, they're very much in need, you know.
Any thoughts, David?
You know, I work with kids, a lot of them are in prison, right, or in juvenile detention centers, or, you know, work with very marginalized young people. And, you know, it's interesting in the whole role model thing, because some of their ideas of role models, you know, are very different, you know, to obviously, you know, folks from the middle classes, right? The kind of people that make impressions upon them. And I'll finish on this. You know, I work now. I've just finished an evaluation of probably the most radical juvenile justice reform in the US at the moment. It's in Washington D.C. and it's called the Credible Messenger Initiative. Right, and I know if you've heard of the term credible messenger, you'll hear it, you know, become much more of a buzzword, you know, as we go on. But basically, you know, what it's about is young people, predominantly young people, being mentored, especially those of them in the system, by people who have been through the system, been in prison, been there, done that, and know that that culture, that side of the, you know, what their community has gone through, right? And you know, normally in the old days, perhaps, you know, they would never have been seen as mentors, right, for young people, because they're bad people, right? They've got histories and so on and so forth. And you don't want those people being the role models, right? But they become incredibly important role models for young people, especially in difficult circumstances, and because they've come through and they've survived and they've, you know, quote unquote, been rehabilitated, and you know, they've got a few lessons, genuine lessons, credible lessons. That's why they call them credible messengers, that the young people can look up to, and they're in their neighborhood, right? They live alongside them. They're not somewhere there out in Hollywood or, you know, Wall Street or Columbia. You know, they're there from their same neighborhood, and that's, you know, to me, that speaks volumes to me. That so many people, different people, can be role models to so many other people. For me, especially young people who don't grow up with those kind of social support systems, you know, to them is someone who reaches them, who loves them, you know, and can reach out to them and be something that and do and say things that are meaningful, and that's enough. You know, we don't have to have some big star and some big fancy, you know, person to be there. It can be so many different people, and that's all about building a community, which is what I think it all comes down to.
Well, I thank you very much, both of you, for being here, for sharing all this historic information and all this background about racism and colorism within and outside our community. What exactly we should be doing as a community, and what should we, as the media or part of the media, be talking about. And any final thoughts that you want to say before we go?
Thanks for inviting me, and
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.